Welcome to Healing the Spirit, a space where we awaken our creativity, deepen our connections, and remember who we are through the lens of astrology, archetypes, and art making. I'm your host, Jonathan Coe. Hello everyone, welcome to Healing the Spirit. I want to share some thoughts today about a topic that's been on my mind quite a lot recently. I'm also seeing this in the lives of my clients, and recently I requested that folks on my Instagram share any questions they might want me to speak to on the podcast, and I'm seeing that this theme seems to be alive in the lives of people around me. So I thought that I'd speak to it on this episode. And if you would like to join along in real time, my sense is that I'm probably going to be talking about various aspects and perspectives on this specific topic throughout the month of July. So stay tuned for that. I don't know if that's going to be the case, but yeah, there's a part of me that feels like this is really just the beginning of me talking about it. So the idea of rubber spirituality, the concept itself, the phrasing came to me while I was walking around after dinner. I was wearing my running shoes and I was feeling the sensation of the rubber soles hitting the pavement in New York City. It made me think of this American English phrase that says where the rubber meets the road. And basically what that means is a theory needs to be put into practice in order to prove itself as true, as useful, as relevant. A theory for theory's sake is lacking and perhaps at best incomplete. And so one way that we can think about this is in terms of athletes, right? Athletes can train all day long. They can learn all these different techniques. They can try all these different training routines. But when they are at the race or competing, that's where the rubber meets the road, and they'll know how good their training really was, right? And similarly, for a musician, you can practice all day long, but it's really your performance on stage that will tell you how helpful your routine has been. And so I'm thinking about how this idea is also relevant to our spirituality. Is it relevant? In what ways is it relevant? And the way that I've been thinking about this is that over the years of having a spiritual practice, what I've noticed is that certain spiritual practices are more useful for me at certain points than at other times, right? And so it's this idea of, when it really comes down to it, what is at the essence of your spiritual practice? Many of the people that I've met, as I'm, traversing various spiritual communities, tend to have exposure to multiple modalities. And the internet makes it easier for us to learn all these different systems, begin all these different practices, find all these teachers. We're no longer limited to our geographic location, right? We're no longer limited to certain kinds of like demographics even, right? We can literally find, say, an astrology teacher or a human design teacher or a tarot teacher with, just typing a few things into Google, right? And seeing what comes up. But in my own journey, what I've seen is that a couple things are true. One is that, usually there's a period of learning where I am very excited about the prospect of learning. I'm very excited about the teacher. I'm very excited about the community. And I just kind of voraciously ingest it all. And then I get to a point where I try things out, right? And as I continue experimenting with the tools, with the practices, with the frameworks, I start to see how certain practices, certain frameworks, certain relationships, even are more useful for me than others, or maybe I gravitate more towards, right? Doesn't mean that the stuff I don't gravitate towards are not important or are not useful, but that um, when it comes down to it, there's a certain level of practicality around how our spiritual practices are limited by who we are and the things that we care about, right? Another way to think about this question is if you can only limit yourself to three spiritual practices in your life in this moment, which practices would you keep? If you have to toss everything else away or stash them away for a later time, which ones would you keep, right? I think this question is really interesting because the internet and um, modernity, and especially this in time that we find ourselves in, makes it feel like we can explore anything. It makes it feel like the possibilities are endless. It makes it feel like there's just absolutely no limit, right? And I don't think this is necessarily true. This is something that I was recently discussing with one of my mentors, Diana Rose Harper, around how when we process our lives through a mental, conceptual, cognitive lens, it may seem like possibilities are endless. But when it comes down to it, our bodies are quite limited. It's like food, right? I would like to think that I am the most adventurous eater in the world. But the reality is that there are just some things that I don't care about, that my body does not respond to or responds negatively to, right? With regards to food. So I think spiritual practices are very similar because we are all walking different paths and there's no one size fits all when it comes to spirituality. And so what I'm really thinking about here is also the ways that often spiritual practices teach us something, right? And underlying spiritual practices are usually spiritual principles. What I mean by spiritual principles um, are kind of beliefs, right? Essentially, we like to think of spiritual practices as not really requiring beliefs. And I don't know if this is true. This is something that I have been struggling with and that I've been pushing back on actually quite a bit recently. This is something I heard a lot when I was first starting to walk my spiritual path, right? And I think it makes a lot of sense because, at least in the Western world, a lot of us who are in spiritual communities or are interested in learning spiritual practices have been hurt in some ways from toxic religious structures and organizations, right? Organized religion essentially, for, pardon my French, really fucked us up, right? And so a lot of people um, go into spirituality because they're essentially refugees from these religious structures. And so it's very appealing when people have been traumatized by religion to tell them that, okay, these practices don't require any beliefs. And I think to a certain extent that is true. I've seen that most of the spiritual practices and modalities that I'm trained in don't require beliefs for it to work, right? However, I think it's also probably a little bit incomplete or disingenuous to say that there were no beliefs that motivate or create the scaffolding necessary for that spiritual practice to make sense. And so I think this is something to consider, right? With regards to this question of rubber spirituality, of what is truly essential in our spiritual practices, in our spiritual lives, that I think there are different ways to kind of conceptualize this, but there's absolutely a relationship between our spiritual practices and the spiritual principles that underlie those practices. And I don't think this is something that we think about enough. Oftentimes, we are satisfied with learning the spiritual practices themselves, or we're too busy learning the different practices and the different um, vocabularies, right? We're just kind of busy catching up. And most people don't really get to the deeper level of what are some of the ideas here that scaffold these practices, right? Or scaffold these modalities. For example, something that I'm thinking about a lot recently is human design, right? Human design is a modality, right? It can also, I guess, be considered a practice if you think about the idea of experimentation in human design. But there are absolutely principles underlying the human design theory or narrative, right? One of them being individuation. Individuation is a huge principle of human design, right? There's this idea that when you learn more about your body graph, when you learn more about the mechanics of how your unique energy works, that you will live a life that is more satisfying to you. You will be able to interact with reality in ways that are more um, exciting and that feel more authentic to you, right? And so, even just in that statement that I'm saying, you can tell that individuation is a huge value in human design. And it underlies a lot of the principles about why we're even doing it, right? Another um, value that's also important in human design, I would say, is um, trusting your own internal authority, right? This is not something that is inherently true in just the kind of technical aspects of the system itself. And yet, it's true if you would like to experiment with it in ways that will be useful, right? In other words, what I'm trying to say here is that there are often certain assumptions that we need to agree on before we can even consider that the spiritual modalities and spiritual practices that we explore are valid or can be useful. And so, why is this relevant, or how is this relevant, right, to this idea of rubber spirituality? I think a lot about the qualities of being or the virtues that spiritual practices have helped me cultivate over the years. For example, when I was practicing a lot of mindfulness meditation, or when I first started out, I didn't really know what mindfulness felt like in my body. It certainly was not a state that I was able to maintain for a long period of time. And it was through the consistent practice of mindfulness meditation that I began to get access to what it even means to find mindfulness within myself, right? And interestingly enough, at some point in my journey, once I was able to access that state in my body and access that way, that quality of being in my reality, I start to need the practice of mindfulness meditation less and less. The technique itself starts to be um, optional, right? At the very least. It started to not be something that I needed to do for like 25 minutes before I start to be in that state of mindfulness. I start to notice that maybe if I were sitting at a work meeting, I can, you know, just remind myself to be mindful. And then slowly I can kind of come back to that state without necessarily having to meditate in front of my coworkers, right? So I think that this concept, right, of rubber spirituality points to the idea that spiritual practices are often built upon spiritual principles. And the fruits of spiritual practices are these virtues or qualities of being that are cultivated over time, right? But if you've been practicing for a while, chances are there's not just one way to get to that quality of being, right? And that quality of being is so deeply intertwined with the spiritual principles that underlie the practices, right? If you want to uh, visualize this, you can think of the spiritual principles as the soil, and then the spiritual practices maybe as the plant, and spiritual virtues or the qualities to cultivate, qualities of being to cultivate as the fruits or the leaves, right? And so the leaves are very much connected to the soil here, right? The qualities of being, like for example, in the case of mindfulness meditation, clearly the principles underlying that practice is that being mindful is useful. Being mindful helps your life, right? So I think it's important to think about our spiritual practices from this lens, right? From this lens of kind of investigating or at least getting curious about what are some of the spiritual principles that underlie my practices. What has these what have these practices helped me cultivate? And are there other ways for me to access that state of being? And are those states of being useful for me at this moment in my life? Because very often, as people walking on this human path, we have goals that move with time and with different periods of our lives. I'm thinking about this idea of unmet needs that I learned from one of my teachers, Leo Garza. Um, this idea essentially that, let's say you have a lot of money, right? When you have a lot of money, maybe what you're seeking out of your occupation is satisfaction or um, the joy of helping other people, right? When money is not a problem. But let's say when money is a problem, then maybe your focus is to replenish your savings in your bank account, right? I don't think that either is necessarily superior. I think it's really just about what do we need in this moment, And um, I think it's important to figure out where are we going in our lives in this moment? What's important to us? What matters less to us? And I think when it comes to our spiritual practices, it's easy to get into um, automatic mode, right? To simply go through the motion, continue doing some of the same practices, and there's something so comforting about that, you know? But when push comes to shove, it might be helpful for you to really consider, are these practices really moving the needles for me? Are they really doing it for me? Are these relationships with non-physical beings relevant at this point in my life? I think this goes back to the idea of agency, right? We all have personal agency with regards to our spiritual path, Maybe not as much as we would like to, but definitely not as little as we'd like to think. And there's something here about exploring various ways of reaching the virtue or the qualities of being that our practices help us do that are outside of the bounds of the prescribed order, right? And I think these periods of kind of figuring out what are these components, how can I be a little bit flexible about them, can be really helpful. One of the questions that I received when I reached out to my Instagram community was from my friend Eloisa. And Eloisa asked me, what's your daily or weekly routine like? How do you balance a day job with spiritual pursuits? This is a question I'm going to be dedicating another episode to. I think this deserves a full episode where I just talk directly to it. But what I will say to it in this moment is that oftentimes, and especially this is true for me in this moment of my life, our desires change. You know, there was a period a few years ago where I was really, really into the idea of spiritual cultivation, where I was spending endless hours just being in meditation, reading my books, right? Catching up on courses, and at that time, exploring different modalities and beginning to gain fluency and mastery in them was very interesting. It was very much the path that was resonant for me. And now I'm kind of in this space where there are other things that I want to do. There are other goals that I have that are, that fall maybe outside of that conventionally spiritual realm, right? And so what do we do with that? I think that this idea of identifying what is at the core of our spiritual practices when the rubber meets the road is very helpful, because then it helps you kind of streamline your spiritual practices a little bit more, right? I think another thing that I want to speak to here is the fact that a lot of our spiritual practices, especially if they are ancient, are taught to us, are inherited to us by mystics and ascetics, right? In other words, people who remove themselves from quote unquote normal society in order to have a heightened experience, in order to be secluded or separated from normal reality, from normal people's responsibilities, so that they can more fully cultivate their understanding, their practices, and their ways of being. And I think this is beautiful. If you are on that path, I commend you and I salute you. I am not on that path. And my sense is that many people listening to this podcast are also not on that path. You have to pay your bills. You have probably mortgages or debts that you have to pay off. You probably have a family. You have children to take care of, aging parents, family members that depend on you. You have a partner that depend on you, right? You want to have a social life, more likely than not. You maybe want to experience these things that modern society has to offer you. You want to go on vacations. You want to have a nice car, right? You want to have a nice house. And I think that it's really important for us to investigate some of the spiritual practices or spiritual principles, rather, that underlie our practices, because when we get deeper into some of these spiritual principles, in order to truly understand them, we also begin to learn a little bit more about the context, right, that surround the practices when they were first taught or when they were first developed. And I find that to be deeply helpful because, one, you always learn a little bit more from the lives of people who live in completely different times than the times that we live in, right? But two, we also get to see the ways that we can maybe adapt our practices to our needs, to our circumstances. Another thing I should mention is that, a lot of spiritual practices are also descended down to us from a subset of society that was pretty wealthy, who didn't have to worry about getting their basic needs met. If you look at a lot of ancient astrologers as well as alchemists, for example, they tend to be people who are quite wealthy and they were very well to do. I recently have been learning about a very specific lineage of Taoism. And a lot of the people who were writing the texts were essentially kings. You know, they were part of the royal family, or they were very, very rich. They came from very, very rich families, and they had a lot of time in their hands, right? And those spiritual practices were also able to descend down to us because somebody wrote them down. And mind you, back then, literacy was not as great as it is today. Nowadays, it's pretty standard, say in the Western world or a lot of, so-called first world country for people to be able to read and write. But this was not the case back then, right? And so I think that spiritual perfectionism is definitely a thing. And I think that spiritual perfectionism erases the reality that for most of us, we have to pay our bills and we have all these other responsibilities that we have to take care of. And we also want to do all these other things. So I do think that a certain level of compromise or molding is necessary, and I think it's healthy. So if you are in this moment of maybe considering, you know, getting to the essence of your spiritual practice, chances are you're maybe graduating from this period of what I'm calling the spiritual honeymoon, right? When we first learned about spirituality, many of us are so voracious when it comes to learning all of the things, right? Learning all of the practices, learning all of the frameworks. And when we get to this point of having learned the basics, oftentimes we need to slow down and we need to start considering how to integrate these practices into our lives, right? Which ones are relevant, which ones are not, right? And my suggestion is for us to be open-minded about it, that some of the things that during my first pass of kind of experimenting with my spiritual practices, some of the things that didn't seem totally relevant became relevant later, right? I don't really know. I think maybe the better policy here isn't to push away or delete the practices that quote unquote don't work, but rather to kind of keep them in your back pocket because there may be times when it becomes useful, right? But I think it goes without saying that our spiritual practices will shift over time. And it's important to understand the spiritual principles that underlie the practices and to understand what the virtues are that are cultivated from the practice. Because when we understand the soil and the fruit, we get to adapt the practices a little bit, right? The practices are really the bridge between the principles and the qualities of being that we can embody, right? The modern mystic finds initiation not through or not exclusively through altered states or rituals or initiations with elders, but through deep engagements with life. And in order for us to deeply engage with life, we need to pay attention. And through paying attention, very often we are asked to adapt. Survival always requires adaptation. Longevity always requires variation. Relevance always requires mutation. And so I'm going to leave you there. Hopefully, this episode has given you some food for thought. It's very likely that I'm going to continue exploring this topic, this idea from multiple different angles and perspectives throughout the month. It's not a promise, but just I feel like there's a lot that I can say about this topic, and I would love to. So yeah, I would be really curious to hear how this is landing for you. Always welcoming you to leave a comment on the podcast app that you're listening to this in, or um, leave a review, or share it on social media, or yeah, reach out to me. I can be found. I'm somewhere on the internet, and I would really love to hear what this inspires within you. Yeah, I'm truly curious. Um, a couple announcements. One is that my books are open. I still have, I believe at this point, 3 slots in July. And I would love to see you for an astrology reading or a divination reading, which I do with the I Ching and the tarot. And then also, I do subtle alchemy sessions, which is basically a combination of energy work and Akashic work. These sessions tend to go pretty deep and profound, fun, illuminating. So, yeah, if you are feeling drawn to working with me one on one, I would absolutely love that. The other announcement that I have is I'm going to leave a link on the show notes below for you to share any questions you may want me to speak to. And I will see which questions are really calling to me and which questions I feel like I have good insights on that I can really speak to. And yeah, it might be turned into an episode. All right. Thank you so much. I deeply appreciate your presence here. I hope that you have a beautiful week coming ahead and a beautiful month. And I'm sending you so much love. Thank you so much for being here.